For question 4, a computer game development company are reviewing their current security solutions. The company wants employees to be aware of how they can identify phishing. Okay, so there is a couple of points. Firstly, we can identify that this is a 4-mark question. So we basically need 4 phrases or 4 keywords to mention to make sure that we get all the marks that we want. So firstly, how does phishing work? We send an email, right? We send an email to the user that we want to use phishing on. This is, of course, malicious activity. So whoever is doing it sends a legitimate looking email. Then the user clicks a link inside of the email, right? This email contains a link and the user presses it. And then the user is redirected to a fake website. And then their basically data is lost or stolen. And the phisher basically does whatever he wants. So these are the main keywords that you want to mention. A legitimate looking email, and then it contains an email. The user presses, it contains a link. The user presses this link and is redirected to a fake website that steals his data or personal activity. So for part B, give 2 ways an employee could identify phishing. So by checking the email address, right? Firstly, checking the email address to make sure it's legitimate. So checking the email address to make sure that someone he knows, or if that it's from a company or someone he trusts, right? Second thing is that they could check the URL or the link, right? Check the link. You could look at the link. Is it a link for a YouTube video? Is it a link for a PDF, a Google Drive? Or is it some website that's unknown and they see it for the first time, right? So these are the 2 main things. Part C asks us for the company has installed anti-malware software on all employees' computers, right? So anti-malware software. This is software that protects the employees' computers from malicious software. Give 3 examples of malware that anti-malware software can detect, right? So anti-malware software can basically detect all kinds of malicious software. For example, viruses, right? Ransomware, worms, Trojan horses, right? Trojan horses, spyware, whatever, any type of malicious software you could think of, just put it in there, right? Anti-malware software can detect all of these malicious softwares. Okay, so for part D, the computer game developers use a high-level language to create a computer game. Part I states what is meant by a high-level language. So a high-level language is basically English-like statements that get converted to machine code and can be used for any program or any machine. Okay, this is the 3 main points that you need to know for high-level language. So English-like statements, right? That's only one of the 3 points I mentioned. However, this is a 1-mark question, which is also a state question. That means that it only wants one solution. That's enough to get your 1 mark. However, if you ever face a 3-mark question for a high-level language, just states that it's English-like statements that gets to be converted to machine code and can be used on any machine. Now, part II, one benefit of using a high-level language is that the code is easy to debug. Give 2 other benefits of using a high-level language. Well, firstly, it's less likely to make errors, right? Less likely to make errors. Secondly, it's quicker and easier to understand, right? So, less errors and easier to understand. Way easier than machine code, or basically low-level languages. Part III, one drawback of using a high-level language is that it must be converted to a low-level language before it can be run. Give one other drawback of using a high-level language. Firstly, and most importantly, it is that it takes longer. It takes longer to convert to the low-level language and then to the machine code. That's firstly. Secondly, it's less efficient with memory. Thirdly, it cannot directly manipulate the hardware. Any one of these will be satisfactory for this question. So let's just write takes more time, right? Any one of these three will be satisfactory for this mark, to get this mark. So part IV states that the computer game developers use an interpreter instead of a compiler when developing the computer game. Explain why an interpreter would be more appropriate for developing the computer game. Firstly, the code will be translated line by line, and whenever the interpreter finds an error, it will stop. So errors can be detected real time, right? Errors can be detected in real time. This is one of the benefits. And there is no need to translate each time an error is fixed, which makes it easier to debug. So all of these are valid solutions for this question. So for question 5, a supermarket wants to start delivering groceries to local elderly people using robots. Describe the characteristics of a robot. Well, firstly, it's simpler than it looks. It has wheels. That means that it can move, right? So that's the first mark. It can move. Of course, you won't write it in bullet points. However, I'm just stating the keywords that you have to plug in. And secondly, normal characteristic of any robot, right? A mechanic structure, right? Electrical components. Okay, any normal characteristic of any robot would be sufficient for this question. Part B, explain one benefit to the supermarket of using robots to deliver groceries to elderly customers. Any normal reason would be good here. So, for example, so state any benefit for the supermarket. For example, it will gain more customers, which will increase their profits. Any normal benefit. Of course, this is a 2-mark question, so you need to state the benefit and explain it. For example, state that the supermarket would gain customers, and then show the examiner that this would lead to getting more profit, right? So explain one drawback to the elderly customers of robots being used to deliver their groceries. Again, this is a 2-mark question, so you have to give the drawback and explain it, right? So any normal thing would suffice here. For example, elderly people won't be familiar with the technology, right? And that would lead to stress, for example, for the elderly people. So any normal reason, right? Any normal reason for a drawback would be sufficient. However, you have to explain it to get the 2nd mark. That's for part B and C. Okay, so for part D, each robot has a media access control, which is a MAC address. So tick one box to show the correct statement about MAC addresses. So MAC addresses is always assigned by the manufacturer, right? It cannot be assigned by the product, since the product is not a real person, right, or a group of people. It's not assigned by the router. Okay, the router has nothing to do with assigning the MAC address, nor the user. For example, you are a user of iPhone or a normal phone. right? But you never assigned any MAC addresses. The manufacturer assigned MAC address. Okay. The robots have artificial intelligence. Give 3 ways the robots could make use of AI. For example, firstly, machine learning, right? That's the first thing that pops up. It could learn to deal with obstacles, right? Learn how it could learn the most efficient route. So for question 6, a computer with a von Neumann architecture has a central processing unit, CPU. Complete the statements about the operation of the CPU. Use the terms from the list. Not all terms will be needed to be used. Okay. So firstly, what stores the address of the next instruction, right? If we just go back and revise the von Neumann architecture, it's a very important topic. What stores the address of the next instruction is actually the program counter. Okay, the program counter. So it stores the address of the next instruction to be fetched. This address is then sent to the... Where is the address sent to? It's sent to, from its name, the memory address register. Okay, the memory address register. The address is the location in the RAM where the instruction can be found. Okay, the instruction is retrieved from the RAM and immediately stored in the... So we're storing the instruction, right? So that means that we're going to store it in the memory data register, right? The memory data register. We get the address in the MAR and then store the data in the MDR. Then the instruction is sent to somewhere where it is decoded by something. So the instruction is sent after the MDR. It's sent to the current instruction register, right, which is CIR, and then it gets decoded by the control unit. By the control unit in the CPU, right? By the control unit. The instruction is decoded using an instruction set, which we talked about in the beginning of the previous episode. So an instruction set. So for part B, handling interrupts is one function of an operating system. An interrupt is sent to the CPU every time the key is pressed on the keyboard. Give the name of this type of interrupt. This is called a hardware, right? A hardware interrupt, because it is caused by a hardware peripheral. Part II, give the name of the program that receives this interrupt, and that is the interrupt handler, right? So from its name, it's very simple. Give one other function of an operating system, and this question is a free mark. You should know 10 of the functions of operating system, right? For example, managing user accounts, managing system security, multitasking, managing memory, managing files, providing an interface, managing the peripherals and the drivers. All of these are functions of operating systems, right? You have to know all of them. A theater, for question 7, a theater has a microphone on stage that is connected by cables to several speakers around the theater. A person speaks into the microphone and their voice is output from the speakers. Identify the most appropriate data transmission method for this purpose and explain your choice. So we have to put in the data transmission method and the explanation. This is a 5-mark question. So the data transmission method will have 1 mark and the explanation will have 4 marks. So all in all, we have 2 types of data transmission methods in our syllabus, right? Serial and simplex. And each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. So any of which would work in this question, but you have to state its advantages. For example, for serial data transmission, you would have to mention that the data will need to travel long distances and only one wire will be used. There's a less chance of error, right? So all of these are sufficient points for serial. If you're mentioning serial, you would have to mention these advantages. For simplex, you would have to mention that the data only needs to be sent in one direction, right? It's unidirectional, and it does not need to be sent back from the speakers to the microphone, right? Because it is only one directional. So you have to state whichever one you want, but you have to state all the reasons and explain why. And that is how you get the mark. So you have to revise serial and simplex if you find this question hard, which are basically the only data transmission methods that we have in our syllabus. And that's all for today.